Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Sharon Anderson. I'm president of Leiomyosarcoma Support and Direct Research Foundation, or LMSDR. And today we are honored to have Dr. Mark Agulnik present for us options in leiomyosarcoma and clinical trials. Dr. Agulnik is a clinician, educator, and researcher who specializes in sarcomas. He joined City of Hope Cancer Center in Southern California following 15 years at Northwestern University in Chicago. Some of you may know him from there. That's where he directed the clinical trials program. And Dr. Agulnik, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Sharon, for inviting me. This is such an honor, and this is such an amazing, like when I look to see how many people have shown up today, I will say, as awful as things have been in the last few years with respect to COVID, it really has taught us that we could bring ourselves all together with the use of technology. And so I don't think 2 years ago we would have done something like this. And so this is absolutely spectacular, and it brings us all a little bit closer. And so it's a complete honor to be here. As you mentioned, I am currently at City of Hope, has been there for the last 18 months running the sarcoma program, and previously ran the sarcoma program at Northwestern, and still collaborate with my colleagues at Northwestern. So I will bring up a slide deck to share with everybody if I'm able to do this. I am not able to do this right now. Let's see.
Check and make sure you are co-host.
I am going to run into.
It's your co-host.
It's not letting me. Let me do share screen.
And again, while we're waiting, would you please mute yourself? That way we won't get background noises.
I apologize to everybody, and I may just end up talking, but oh, it may work out this way.
I always stumble when it's time to share my screen.
It's my computer's not letting me share, but now it is.
Okay.
I had to get permission from my computer. Okay, I apologize for that technology. Okay, so what I'm going to discuss is cancer clinical trials and what clinical trials are. I gather, Sharon, you could just answer if you could see the slides.
We can.
Perfect. So I added my email address at the bottom of the page. So if people want to reach out to me, I'm happy to help them field information. I realize everybody can't come to the Los Angeles area for treatments, but I could certainly help advise on who would be a sarcoma specialist in your area. And so certainly if there's any way that I could help anybody, I think email is probably the easiest way to get a response from me. And that's why I put that one there. And so as Sharon had mentioned, I am the sarcoma section chief at City of Hope. And so clinical trials, the way I see them, they're really carefully designed medical research studies that are conducted in order to test promising treatments, prevention, diagnostics. But really what we're always trying to do in a research information is to answer a scientific question. And so whether that be a drug study, whether it be, we often do a lot of studies that are health outcomes research. So we want to understand what patients are thinking, what their process of thought is. So really trying to understand the patient journey, not just the treatments for the patients. And so often the patients, but as well as the caregivers. And so there will be times where you'll receive information about participating in research that is quality of life with respect to anxiety questionnaires, with respect to depression questionnaires, things like that. So when we talk about clinical trials, there are several ways or several sponsors of these clinical trials. So predominantly for sarcomas, and leiomyosarcoma is put into that category. When we look about investigational new drugs, we are thinking about the pharmaceutical industry, and pharmaceutical corporations are sponsoring these drugs. And by sponsoring, I mean that they are paying centers in order to conduct these. So they're helping to support the salaries of the research nurses, the research coordinators, the data managers, and all the infrastructure that is needed, including paying for pharmacy distribution of drug and things like that. Often academic medical centers will partner in order to create an investigator-initiated trial, and I will talk soon about an investigator-initiated trial we currently have ongoing for leiomyosarcoma. And so what happens is that they will petition companies in order to supply a drug for them, but they have full ownership over the research, but obviously the pharmaceutical industry has to sign off on it. And then other times we'll have the NCI, which is the National Cancer Institute, which will form cooperative groups that will end up allowing groups to form collaborations together. And so with respect to leiomyosarcoma, we often think about SARC, which is the Sarcoma Alliance for Research Collaboration. And then there are other ones as well. Alliance is another group that does sarcoma research as well and currently has an ongoing angiosarcoma trial. So the purpose of clinical trials is to answer a question, and the type of trials that we look at are either going to be interventional, and so these would be treatment or prevention. They'll also be screening studies or quality of life studies. And so if you were asked to participate in a study that's looking at understanding the genetics of leiomyosarcoma, then perhaps what you would end up having is that they would want to capture your information with respect to your NGS reports and genetic testing reports. So why do we do clinical trials and why are these important? So you have a Facebook page with thousands of people on it, and the question is, why are people on this page? People are on this page to form a community, is my understanding, but to also get information and improve upon what they already know and try to get the latest information. And you try to learn from each other because let's say the patient who we were talking to before in Melbourne, Australia goes to see their doctor in Melbourne, Australia. They may have access to something that perhaps a patient who's in Omaha, Nebraska doesn't know. And so they're able to pull that information and bring it to their doctor and say, hey, someone I know was trying this drug, it was working, yes or no. So essentially clinical trials are important because we're trying to advance standard of care. Standard of care treatment is the treatment we would offer you that would be considered the same treatment that everybody would get anywhere in the country. We're also trying to understand the disease. And so if we offered you a drug and the drug worked in 80% of leiomyosarcoma patients and it involves a certain pathway, then we understand that the pathway is a critical pathway to the development of cancer and leiomyosarcoma in particular. And then, of course, it's the FDA. And as much as the FDA could be a nuisance, the FDA is an incredible benefit because the FDA is specifically looking to protect us all. And so the FDA requires rigorous work that will then be approved and they will get drugs to market, which will then have access for all of us. So randomized trials are going to be several different components. You're going to have phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I will talk to you about that shortly. But in 1948 is the first randomized controlled trial. And so that was using streptomycin versus placebo for pulmonary tuberculosis. And we've come a long way since then. But essentially, we randomize our trials. So we offer different patients different treatments in order to try to eliminate the bias. So what we try to do is if any patient is walking into my office, I'm forming a relationship with that patient and I'm forming an emotional relationship with that patient as well. And I obviously want the patient to do well. I obviously open up clinical trials because I anticipate the trials that we have that the new material is going to be better than what we already know. And so if I had every patient walk in my office and every patient got this new drug because I thought it was better, then essentially you're introducing a bias into it because I essentially think something's better. So essentially we're trying to eliminate bias and treat patients in a more randomized fashion so that we could have a better answer. So in phase 3 trials, we often randomize patients and often we blind or double blind. Double blind is when I may not know what treatment you're getting and you won't know what treatment. Usually the only person who knows what treatment is going to be the pharmacist who's going to distribute it. And so those are ways of really eliminating bias so that we don't know what's happening until we analyze all the data. So if we look at the leading cause of death in 1900 versus 2010, we certainly see cancer start to rise from 8 to 2, and we certainly see that we need to do a better job at controlling disease and treating it and getting better outcomes. So what have we learned from clinical trials? Well, we certainly know that race, gender, ethnicity could be risk factors for certain cancers. We know that there is the Human Genome Project that dates back to 20 years now that allows us to better understand each other and better understand the tumors. And so when we talk about genes, we talk about two different aspects. And so it's very important when we all approach our doctors, we think about this carefully. One is the genes that you're born with. And so this is all inherited. I apologize for my dog who's barking. Okay. One is going to be the genes that we are born with. So these are the genes that are passed on by our parents. And the other is going to be the genes that we acquire. And so this is going to be acquired into the tumor. So your tumor genes may look very different than the genes that you were born with. And then we're really trying to create these emergent therapies that will target the genetic abnormalities in your tumors, which will often offer fewer side effects in that situation. So how do we develop medicines? So the treatments that we offer everybody, we're developing, certainly they start in the lab, there's going to be animal testing, and then they're going to take them to clinical trials. Just hold on one quick second.
What we get to work, it's just a line is long and more, so what you have in store. I got some salt, and some mayonnaise, and some ketchup. Because I know you like ketchup.
I signed up for this.
Tissue.
Okay, that should have taken care of the problem. I apologize. So when we look about clinical trials, we're looking at phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 clinical trials. And we'll discuss what each of these mean.
It's a recording Zoom for the gate.
So when we
Let me interrupt for a second. Somebody needs to mute
that I signed up for.
so we can hear your conversation and it's being recorded. Everybody check to make sure you're muted. Thank you.
Okay, that's wonderful. I appreciate that. So in phase 1, we're looking at the first studies that are being tested in humans. And so we're looking for safety. But ultimately, those of us who are doing phase 1 clinical trials are also looking for whether or not we could catch a signal of activity. And a signal of activity means if I put 18 patients into a phase 1 clinical trial and 3 of them have a leiomyosarcoma and we see 3 responses, then certainly I'm going to be very intrigued to take that drug to a phase 2. Phase 2 is when you're looking at drug effectiveness. So is the drug effective? So you set a standard and you want to see if you put, let's say, 50 patients, 60 patients into this study, will you hit a mark where the drug is potentially better than other drugs that are currently on the market? The FDA is often trying not to bring drugs to market that are equivalent. Often they're looking to bring drugs to market that are more effective. In phase 3, we're comparing investigational drugs with standard of care, and these could be drugs used by themselves, but it could also be combination. And phase 4 is ongoing safety data, and this is post-FDA approval. So the way things work and how a clinical trial gets initiated is very important because when we talk about clinical trials, often patients are frustrated, I should say, because things don't seem to move quickly. And the reason things don't seem to move quickly is because you need to make sure that you're crossing all the T's, dotting all the I's, and making sure that you are creating ethical and safe research for patients. And so patient safety is of utmost importance every time we pursue a clinical trial. And so for those of us that work in National Cancer Institute designated cancer centers, and that's going to be mostly at academic centers, we have to have a disease team will meet. So all of us who treat sarcoma, and that includes the surgeons, the radiation oncologists, medical oncologists, pathologists, radiologists, will meet to discuss once or twice a month to discuss all the projects that we want to open for our patients. And as a group, we have to have consensus of more than 50% sign off that this is the right mission for our team. Once you have that, the protocol is submitted to a scientific review. The scientific review is a group of physicians as well as pharmacists and nurses and mid-level providers who will look at the scientific aspects of the study and make sure it is scientifically sound. And then we'll also ask for the statisticians to look at it to make sure that the research being done can answer the question, because you don't want to enroll patients into a study that will never answer a question. And then it goes to the review board. That is an ethics committee, and the ethics committee will have patients on it that will represent community. They'll have lay people. So they'll have representation right across the board. And what you want to make sure is that the language you're using in the consent form is appropriate for, I believe you want it to be a second or third grade level so that most people will be able to understand it. And you want to make sure that the information that's being provided is going to be honest and without bias. And so after you have the protocol submitted, you have the scientific review, you have an institutional review board, you have contracts done with legal departments, and you have the finance department making sure that it is feasible to do it financially, then you initiate the trial and you start to enroll the patients. And so really from start to finish at City of Hope, we try to do it in 3 months. Other places try to do it within 6 months. And so from the first time that everyone on Facebook may hear about this new leiomyosarcoma trial, it really could be 6 months before the first patient is enrolled. And so it is one of these things where there's a lot of anticipation. And I feel the frustration from patients who often come looking for trials. And I say, yes, we're about to open the trial, but about to open the trial is months away typically. And so there is this process where everything has to be done in order to make sure that we are safe for patients. There is some aspects of clinical trial work that we have to admit. We try a lot of drugs for a lot of patients, and often we're creating equivalence, and that means we're not making things better. If we're not making things better, the FDA often isn't going to give us an approval. And so if you look at oncology drugs, the approval rate is about 6%. So we are trying a lot of drugs for a lot of patients and potentially creating situations that are slightly better, slightly equivalent, probably not that much worse, but certainly not necessarily getting new drugs on the market. And so this slide is probably a little bit outdated. I should update it. But the numbers of new drugs to market is high, but the number of drugs being evaluated is astronomically high. So I think there are a lot of myths and a lot of things that come in. And the first thing I hear from almost every patient is, I don't want to get a placebo. And so let's talk about this. And so myth number one is, I might receive a placebo instead of the active treatment. And so as a whole, placebos are rarely used in cancer clinical trials unless there is no established standard of care. And you will never get a placebo unless you know that there's a potential to get a placebo. So no one's switching something out, no one's altering what you're getting. We use placebos when there isn't an established standard. And so for instance, we have a clinical trial that's ongoing looking at a condition called desmoids or fibromatosis, and this falls in the sarcoma category. And we know that patients don't necessarily need to be treated right away. And so there is this time that we do have an opportunity to take some time. And so in those studies, there are placebos involved. There are other studies looking at liposarcomas that often are low grade and not very aggressive. So often we are using placebos in those situations as well. With respect to leiomyosarcoma, there is one study that I'm aware of that had at one point used the placebo, which I think altered in the trial eventually, but it's unlikely a leiomyosarcoma patient would be offered a placebo. It isn't going to happen. Myth number two is that clinical trials are not safe. And so what we've gone through already is all the steps to open up a trial. So each step in drug development is highly regulated to ensure the safety and protection of research participants. And that one has to remember that everybody sitting on this, this Zoom call today, if you've ever been on a therapy, you've only been on that therapy because someone else potentially on this Zoom call was on that clinical trial. And so none of the therapies we have today exist without the use of clinical trials. And so those of us who are sarcoma specialists always will recommend patients to enroll in clinical trials. If I consent to a clinical trial, I lose the chance to receive more effective standard treatments. And so the consent process is a long process. It could be 30, 40 pages, but it is not a binding contract. And so standard treatments are always available to patients, and patients may withdraw participations in a clinical trial at any time for any reason, and you do not require to give a reason. It is your prerogative, it is your body, and your body doesn't have to receive a therapy that you do not want to receive. Participating in a clinical trial means that there is no hope. So certainly we know that clinical trials are often available for all stages of cancer, including newly diagnosed and untreated, and there is always a sense of hope. We use the clinical trials because we are hopeful. And so I would never want anyone to walk into my office and for me to say to them, I have this clinical trial because I'm excited about the possibility of giving something new and something potentially better. And I would hate to think that someone feels that I'm meaning that there is no hope. So what we say is one thing, what you hear is something else, and I would hate for you to hear something that is negative and lacking hope, when in reality, I'm coming in very hopeful and excited. And so clinical trials are often available for all stages of cancer. And so currently we do have 2 clinical trials, both available for leiomyosarcoma and both available for patients who have never had any chemotherapy before. And so that is for what we call chemo-naive patients. We're excited about these studies. And so there are trials available to try to make things better for patients who have never had any treatment. So how do you enter a clinical trial? So there are eligibility criteria, there's an informed consent process, and that really is your opportunity to learn about the potential benefits and side effects. As I said before, it is not a contract. It is essentially an open dialogue between patients and clinicians and the clinical team. And so what I sort of bring to the table, I bring in my research nurse, I bring in my nurse, and really we are going to spend a lot of time together. And in this time that we're going to spend together, I really hope everybody feels that we have the person's best interest. We are not looking to gain something by putting patients on a clinical trial. We're looking to participate in your healing process and your treatment, and we want to offer something that we feel is in your best interest. I apologize for 1 second. I need to make a very quick phone call. It's an urgent call from work. I really apologize. So maybe Sharon, you could talk a little bit. I'm just going to put myself on mute.
I am very happy to talk. Okay. And that's what happens when we ask very busy, committed doctors to do presentations for us during the work week. Anybody have some questions they want to write down in the chat? Please feel free. And someone asked for the email, his email, which I'll ask for him to put in the chat for us all when he returns. Okay. So, one question is, Susie asked, is Dr. Agulnik able to consider my sister as a patient? You would have to give him a lot more information about your sister, like where she is or why he wouldn't be able to. Oh, there we go. There's the email again. Okay. I'm glad you like it, Vicki. And Susie too. Okay. And I'm always looking for more suggestions for our webinars. We try to have 1 a month. And we have our recordings already on the LMSDR website. Now my dog's gonna bark. And one thing I thought was very interesting is he said they have a clinical trial for people who don't have any tumors right now. So I think that's an interesting clinical trial. It's probably adjuvant chemotherapy, but we'll see what that is. So normally, to be able to test a drug, they want to see a tumor and its effect on a tumor. I actually participated in a clinical trial that was a phase 1 at Dana-Farber that was a cancer vaccine, and I did not have a tumor at the time because the phase 1 is asking the question, is this safe? So they're also looking at it and saying, is it working? But the first question in a phase 1 is it safe? So unfortunately, it didn't work for me, but it was definitely safe. I don't think it went on to a phase 2. And if you want to find clinical trials on your own, you can go to www.clinicaltrials.gov and just put in the search box leiomyosarcoma. You could put other search terms in there too if you want. You can also see by location where clinical trials are. And I also put them in the newsletter, the LMS alerts every 2 weeks. I have the predominant trials, but it's not extensive. So you should be able to, here, I'll put it in the text box. And it's clinical, whoops, sorry about that, clinicaltrials.gov.
And my next slide will go over that as well.
Hello.
Yeah, sorry about that. It
right.
is true when you ask us to do this and it's 4 o'clock, there's still an hour, a few hours in the workday, so I apologize.
Well, we just appreciate you coming and doing this for us.
Of course, of course. Do you want me to continue?
Please, because I don't do a good job.
Okay, so when we talk about clinical trials, we talk about potential benefits. We're talking about gaining access to advanced treatments, extending treatment options. And so if you think about how many drugs are currently FDA approved for leiomyosarcoma, it is going to be less than 2 handful. And so if you start looking at other options and other clinical trials, you start to increase the number of trials that are available. The study treatment does come for most cases at no cost, and so that is a benefit. And you are always helping to contribute to the advancement of medicine. And I do think everyone on a treatment has to at one point respect and really acknowledge the fact that they are on that treatment because someone else had agreed to go on to a clinical trial. Okay. The potential risks, however, are there. So there are potential for unknown side effects of study treatment, and the studies may require additional time than standard therapies, and the study treatments may be ineffective. And so that's the hard part. For a lot of the early studies that we do, it does require long days, about 12 hours, because patients are having constant EKGs and blood draws. And so certainly there are other things that are going on that do have an effect. So who is watching out for everyone's interests? So besides your physicians and the teams at the hospital, the Food and Drug Administration, the National Cancer Institute, the institutional review boards, and the physicians and the investigators, the data is being analyzed constantly. Every side effect that happens gets reported within 24 hours. Every side effect gets an attribution of whether or not it's related to the study drug or if it's related to something else. Everything is scrutinized, looked at carefully, and on every study there is a data safety monitoring board, which is an independent board that is not hired by the companies and is acting independently to make sure that patient safety is utmost important. So you need to know your options. And so the questions that I think are often important to ask when you're sitting in your doctor's office is, what are my other options? Because you want to make sure that they're not just giving you one option, but you want to hear all of the options, because you yourself are going to have opinions about side effect profiles, and certain treatments are going to be more reasonable to you and certain treatments are going to be less reasonable, and some side effects are going to be acceptable, some are not. If you have young children, busy families, busy work environment, and you can't go to the hospital 3 or 4 days in a row to have blood draws, then that study is not an option for you. You also want to know who put the study together, so it's important to know who is the what we call as the sponsor. Where is the trial being conducted? So I think it's important to understand who else in the country is doing it. What will you get out of the study? Meaning, what are they looking for as the endpoint? What are your risks? How long does the study last? And what testing is involved in the study? And all of these should be outlined in the consent forms. So how do you find a clinical trial? Oh, so this is an older slide, so I apologize. I didn't correct it to leiomyosarcoma. But essentially what you want to do is you ask your doctor for help. So any of us in the clinic have a computer in front of us and could show you. You reach out to a medical center that often has a library. And so I don't know if everybody knows this, but the libraries are resource centers at academic centers, cancer centers throughout the United States. And these are phenomenal. And the librarians could help search for clinical trials. Or you go online in the comfort of your own home to www.clinicaltrials.gov. And this is not restricted to the United States. This is studies that are done throughout the world. And so there were people on earlier I saw from New Zealand, from Australia, from Hong Kong. So this would apply to them as well. So what you're going to do is on clinicaltrials.gov, you're going to look at this and you're going to put in a condition. So here we put in sarcoma, we put United States, we put California, and then City of Hope is in a city called Duarte, just outside of Los Angeles. And so we put in Duarte and we come up with 92 studies are found that do this. And so essentially how you could then slim things down further is you probably want to find studies that are recruiting. I'm not sure that most people that are looking for a study are that concerned with studies that have terminated or completed or are no longer enrolling patients. Sometimes you want to look at age, so you want to look if you're 18 to 64 or 65 and above, or if you're doing this for an adolescent or a child, then you could do birth to 17. And then you also sometimes want to do study type, and the study type, often I end up putting in for patients something that's going to be investigational or treatment, they're called. And then you get studies pop up. And so here are 3 studies. The middle one is the leiomyosarcoma study that we have that is specifically for leiomyosarcoma. And so this is how you find out what is recruiting, meaning recruitment means that you have a spot available. And you're looking also on the right-hand side, it will tell you where else this study is being done. The middle column will tell you what the disease site is, and the column second to the end is going to tell you what drug is being used, so you could always check into that. And so what we have that's very exciting for our leiomyosarcoma patients is a study, which is a phase 2 study of cabozantinib and temozolomide in patients with unresectable or metastatic leiomyosarcoma and also other soft tissue sarcomas. So the way the study works is that patients will be screened based on eligibility. So it's patients who have had a diagnosis that is in keeping with what we're studying. Patients have to have had between 1 to 4 prior therapies, I think up to 5. If you've had 6 or 7 different lines of therapies, unfortunately, this study is not available. And then in the first cohort, we're looking for 42 patients with leiomyosarcoma. And so how we do this is we do it in 2 stages. We treat the first 13 or 14 patients. We have to make sure that we see activity. If we see activity, we then open it up further. So we are now into our second cohort. And so we have seen the activity we were looking for, and we hope that after 42 patients, we will see exactly what we want. In cohort 2, we will have up to 30 patients who don't have leiomyosarcoma, and we are currently accruing that. The study is open in City of Hope. It is open at Northwestern University in Chicago, at University of Iowa, at Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and it is open at WashU in St. Louis. And so it is open through the Midwest and also in the West Coast. The treatments are oral treatments, which is nice for patients. The cabozantinib is an FDA-approved drug that is not approved for sarcomas. And so cabozantinib is 40 milligrams, that's daily. And the temozolomide is dosed for 5 days in a row. And so in a 28-day period, you get 5 days of temozolomide and 28 days of cabozantinib. Every 6 weeks for the first 12 weeks, you have a CT scan to make sure your disease is responding or is not progressing, and then every 8 weeks thereafter. And really the endpoints are going to be looking at progression-free survival. So how long does it go without your tumor progressing? And so we continue treatment until disease progresses. There's an unacceptable toxicity. There's a subject preference to come off, or there's a physician recommendation to come off. So also, if you're in the Los Angeles area or want to travel to City of Hope, you look at our webpage. So you could do this for any center looking to find clinical trials. And then lastly, I'm proud of our City of Hope sarcoma care team. And so this is an entire group of physicians that have dedicated their time and energy to making things better for patients with sarcomas and hoping that we could make a difference for everybody that we encounter. So I thank you very much. I thank you for the interruptions, unfortunately, between the work and the dog. I guess real life gets in the way of everything else.
Yes, well, thank you. We appreciate you taking your time during the work week. We have some questions, and people can unmute themselves to ask questions, or we can read them in the chat. Let's see what we've got here. Let me go to the top. That was very comprehensive. I really appreciate it. Did you say this trial that you have, you don't have to have a tumor?
No, for my trial, you have to have something called RESIST criteria. RESIST criteria means measurable disease. Measurable disease means that you have to have more than 1 centimeter of tumor.
Okay.
So I could go through some of the chat and answer some of the question if that's okay.
Sure.
So Kathleen Bain has asked, what % of patients need to be successful for a trial to go to phase 3? So a trial goes to phase 3 if there is a thought that the treatment will be better than what you have as standard of care. Often we try to improve things by 20%, sometimes by 30%, and that's usually where we go. The phase 2 success is defined as a endpoint. So for instance, the study we have, the endpoint is set that you're going to have a certain % of patients are going to be lacking disease progression at the 12-week mark, which is 3 months. And so usually you want to see like 65% of patients will not progress, and so that they could be on the drug for more than 3 months. You want patients on the drug more than 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months.
Great, thank you.
So,
Joseph, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say Alnis Briedis, and I apologize if I say the names incorrect, was asking, do you need to have a tumor to be on a clinical trial? So you don't need a tumor to be on a clinical trial. It just depends what trial you're looking to get on. If you are cured of your tumors, there are some clinical trials that we've done in the past, and those are what we call maintenance trial or adjuvant trials. Currently, I'm not familiar with many, but certainly at any given time, you ask your physician, are there any trials that are available? Most trials in sarcomas are treatment trials, and they're for patients who have active disease.
Great, thank you.
So Angelina Lamb asks, what do you do for patients that are stable at the moment? So for stable patients, there is the ability to enroll in some clinical trials, because often the clinical trial enrollment is for patients who have disease, and it doesn't ask for disease that is growing. I will say, though, if you have stable disease is the right answer to go on a trial, whereas a better answer to try to take a drug holiday, recover from the side effects of the treatments, and then only go on a trial if the disease progresses, because your disease could be quite dormant. And if the disease is dormant, it's not growing. And really, in my mind, you need to start to consider therapies for diseases that grow. And so for me personally, I'm not a huge fan of putting patients on who have stable disease. My preference is to give patients some time away from treatments to allow them to regain stamina, improve fatigue, get back some strength, and only put them back on treatments after when the tumors start to grow. What we're trying to do here, and we didn't talk about LMS as much for this, but we're trying to create these situations where your disease is a chronic condition, and chronic conditions need treatment, but they don't always need treatment at every given moment. They often sometimes need treatment for a few months a year and then a few months off. And there's this back and forth between times on and off treatment that often help patients out. So Kathleen Bain asked, in a phase 3 trial, if there is no placebo, what is the control group measured against? So that's a great question. So for example, we're opening up a phase 3 clinical trial for liposarcoma. The control group will be adriamycin, which is also known as doxorubicin, and many of you on this call have probably had this. And the experimental arm is an experimental agent from Boehringer Ingelheim is the company. And so it is an agent looking to alter something in the genetic makeup of the tumor, and it is comparing itself to chemotherapy. And so most of the time it is a chemotherapy is going to be the control group, and it's going to be a drug that's approved for the disease that we're treating. Okay, so I think Lynn Hewitt asks a very good question. So she's with her husband at a very reputable site in the country, and she's relying on that center to provide information about clinical trials. So what I feel, her question is, she should be doing the work herself, or does she rely on her doctor? So what I do think is there are probably 30, 40, 50 of us throughout the United States at major centers that predominantly devote our entire career to the treatment of leiomyosarcoma and other sarcomas, and I think most of us know what is available. Do I know every study at every single center? No. Do I know studies that are available at UCLA, at Cedars-Sinai, at USC, at UCSD? Yes, because those are all drivable to me. And so I feel for me, it makes sense for me to know this because then it helps my patients out. Do I know what's available at Memorial Sloan Kettering right now? No, because the likelihood of my patients in California flying across to New York is probably not that high. But certainly if a patient ever walked in and asked me what's available and said, I'm willing to travel anywhere, then I certainly put the information in. So I think for Lynn, I think you're at a very reputable place with some great people, and I would just ask them to help you navigate that. And if you felt that they couldn't help you, then what I would say is, do they have a librarian at the center that could help you? So Susie is asking about different choices of treatment with respect to chemotherapy, oral therapies, and clinical trials, and how do you decide? So I think often what you're trying to do is you are trying to decide how to best to sequence it. So in my mind, if the clinical trial that you have available for your sister, Susie, will not allow you to be on prior chemotherapy because it is a first-line treatment, then to my mind, if you're interested in the clinical trial, you go with the clinical trial. If you could do the clinical trial as a second, third, or fourth-line treatment if other treatments don't work, then maybe you don't want to do that now. You try something more proven and then go to the trial. But I have to say I've devoted my career to clinical trial work, and I always say trials first. The choice of a chemotherapy IV versus a tablet is a choice based on likelihood of response as well as side effect profile. If your sister is older than age 60, there are some studies out of Germany that have looked at the tablet medication. I think you're probably asking about pazopanib, and have shown that pazopanib is as effective as chemotherapy in patients older than 60. And so that could be a good choice, but I think you're looking at the side effect profiles. I see one from Susie Siegel. Hello, Susie. It's good to see you out here today, always providing great information. And I think, so Lynn is asking about the clinicaltrials.gov. Will it tell you where the trials are available? It will either tell you where the trials are available, or it will give you a contact number for the pharmaceutical company that's running the trial, and you would call a hotline, and they will then set you up at the closest center. And so, for instance, we have a trial ongoing with a very rare condition called a clear cell sarcoma. It's only opened at maybe 4 centers in the United States. And the company is diverting patients to the different centers, and they're using philanthropy from advocacy groups to help pay for patients to be able to fly. And so, for instance, I treated a young gentleman from Texas. And so he was able to afford to come to the trials because other people are so generous. And so often the companies will help set you up. So how many months of progression-free survival is considered successful? Kathleen Bain is asking. So I really think that's a personal question. We've had studies where some drugs get approved with a very small improvement in progression-free survival because nothing else has worked. And other studies, you really want to see numbers that are closer to 3, 4, 6-month improvements. Personally speaking, and I say this to patients, someone does better than everyone else, and why can't that be you? So if I tell you the drug has a median progression-free survival of 3 months, but one patient was on it for 5 years, why can't you be on it for 6 years? And so I think anytime you walk into a study or walk into a treatment, don't believe everything you hear, prove everyone wrong, and someone does better than everybody else. Side effects of oral chemotherapy are going to be different. The oral chemotherapies that we have in this study are very well tolerated. It's a drug called temozolomide. This is a question again from Denise. It is Oh, someone asked if I could stop sharing my screen. Of course. Okay, so the oral chemotherapy that we have is very well tolerated. It is very similar to a drug called dacarbazine, which some of you may have already had. Oh, I thought I lost you. Okay, it's very similar to a drug called dacarbazine, which a lot of you probably have had, but it's an oral agent. This one's easy to tolerate. Other oral agents like pazopanib, which is a targeted therapy, not chemotherapy, doesn't cause hair loss, but it will cause your hair to turn white. It could cause some fatigue, some hand-foot syndrome, high blood pressure. So everything is going to have different side effects, and you're just going to have to be able to tease out what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. Could someone who is recovering from a liver abscess go on the trial? So this is for me, Kim. For the cabozantinib and temozolomide, if you're recovering from an infection, you can't go on the trial until you're fully recovered, but that is certainly a discussion that you should reach out to me if you're in this area, and we could discuss that. Susan McMullen, great question, asking about enlotinib. So enlotinib is an oral targeted agent that is approved in China. The original studies out of China were a phase 3 study looking at, I believe, leiomyosarcoma, synovial sarcoma, and alveolar soft part sarcomas. And the study was very effective for the alveolar soft part sarcomas and effective for synovial and for leiomyosarcoma. It got approval in China, and I believe the studies in the United States have fully accrued. The data seems impressive and important. I am cautiously optimistic, and I certainly hope enlotinib proves to be better than some of the other drugs we have, and so that would give us another opportunity. And I believe I've got through most of them.
Yeah, I think Maria is asking how effective is your trial?
So our trial, so our trial is currently ongoing. It's a trial. And so to be fair to the trial and all the participants, we can't give out individual information. What I will say, and I think in full transparency, it's important, our trial is a 2-stage design. The first stage is the first 13 or 14 patients. As long as the first 13 or 14 patients in that have enough activity to reach the benchmarks that we're looking for, which means we're looking for this to be better than most second-line agents, then we will open the trial up to a full 42 patients, and we have already gone beyond that, so we are accruing the full 42. So in a roundabout way, I'm telling you that the initial patients have excitement, and we're excited about it, and we hope after the full 42 that we will have an answer that we're looking for, that this becomes a viable option. We don't need to take this study any further than a phase 2 study because both drugs are commercially available and on the market. And so if we got enough activity, we would then have this study incorporated into our guidelines, which are NCCN guidelines, National Cancer Comprehensive Network. So that is guidelines created by sarcoma specialists around the country. And there's guidelines for breast cancer, lung cancer, every cancer has guidelines. But if they're in the guidelines, traditionally the insurance companies will cover it. And so that is the goal. For a lot of these studies, the goal is to get activity in phase 2 and then get them in guidelines so as many of you as possible could get access.
Great. I have a question. I often search clinicaltrials.gov and I put in trials for leiomyosarcoma in the newsletter and try to explain them if I can. I have trouble with new drugs getting information about them so that I can explain them to patients. You know, what are they? Are they targeted? Are they, you know, what are they, traditional cytotoxic chemotherapies? So how do I find out about the actual drugs?
So you could do exactly what I do, which is essentially just Google the drug.
Okay.
So Googling the drug will take you, it's as simple as that. So Googling the drug will take you to the website for the company. The company will explain to you what their pipeline drugs are, and you essentially are trying to look at that. And so often, so I could explain things to patients. We have a lot of clinical trials. Every once in a while, someone will ask me something more specific, and I'll be like, you know, that's a great question. Let's just look up the name of the drug. Excuse me. Often the drugs don't have names. They're only going to be like BI 88429. And so that would imply BI is the company, so Boehringer Ingelheim. 88529 is the number of their next drug compound. And so essentially I just Google it and you'll find the companies will release information, and in the release it will talk about what type of drug it is. Also, when we put information in clinicaltrials.gov, we put very careful information and we put things that should be in layperson's language. And so it doesn't always talk about what the drug is. And so that's the barrier, and I agree with you. So essentially Google, and then you have my email address now. So email me and I'll be happy to send out a 2-liner and answer the question for you. And that may just be easier.
I love it. We'll have to get you to be on part of our scientific board.
Would love to.
Member.
Anytime. Anything I could do to help the cause.
And I am one of those that advocate for people to go on clinicaltrials.gov, look at trials available, and take it to your doctor to discuss, because they're not always aware of everybody else's trials. So they can discuss it with you. Yeah. Well, thank you, thank you, Dr. Agulnik. I really appreciate this. I see we have comments of people who are very happy with today's presentation and very appreciative of it. So thank you again. Oh, here comes all the thank yous. So
I really thank you for letting me interact with everybody. In a clinic situation, you interact one-on-one. It's nice to see a community because sometimes you forget that there's an entire community behind everybody. And so it's really nice to see. Everyone's lucky.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you once again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.